What? What? It's supposed to be a good book. Listen, I know Gareth Howells is supposed to be a really nice guy, but you have to be able to separate the art from the artist, Roger. And I'm sure we'll find out something terrible about him someday. I mean, it's got to happen eventually, right? Hello, my friends. Hello. And welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor, where I was just talking to Roger about separating the art from the artist. I really don't think we'll find anything creepy about Gareth Howells. I think that's unlikely. But, you know, you've probably heard the term separating the art from the artist quite a bit recently. Mostly because of this creep. It's Neil Gaiman. It's that jackass Neil Gaiman and his book, American Gods. This is my fancy pants annotated edition of American Gods, which I got a couple years ago, and I remember being very excited about getting it. For some reason, I never got around to reading it. I will eventually. I have read American Gods, and I liked it. I liked it quite a bit. I don't know if it's as great as a lot of people say it is, but I thought it was pretty good. And recently, we found out Neil Gaiman is a creep. And there are a lot of allegations going on against Neil Gaiman. And it disappointed a lot of people. Understandably. It's understandable that this disappointed a lot of people. The accusations against Neil Gaiman, because Neil Gaiman seemed like a nice guy. You know, none of us knew him personally. I mean, some people knew him personally, but most of us who read his books don't know this guy. But we have seen him, you know, he's in like every documentary about everything. It seems like he shows up all over the place. And every time he does, he seems like a nice fella. But, well, it turns out maybe not. And this is a familiar disappointment, you know. It happens. Remember this book? It's The Mists of Avalon. This was actually a pretty big deal at one time, but I don't often hear anybody talk about it on BookTube. At least not that often. Probably because it was written by Marion Zimmer Bradley. So now whenever anybody talks about this book, they have to be like, oh yeah, this book is really... But, you know, I know about... But I know about... Yeah, but the book itself... You know, because they have to be apologetic about reading and talking about this book just because of, you know, Marion Zimmer Bradley. So there's that, you know. Often we find things out about authors or artists that are completely unexpected and sometimes disturbing. Remember when we found out that Joe Shuster drew a bunch of pervy pictures? Remember that? That was a shock. I mean, what's this? What's going on here, Joe Shuster? This is just... Actually, this kind of makes me like Joe Shuster even more than I already did. My goodness, this is sheer naughtiness going on. He was naughty, Joe Shuster. Who knew? We thought he just drew Superman. It turns out he was a lot more fun than that. You know, sometimes you find out shocking things. I remember, you know, this was disappointing. Neil Gaiman, this was disappointing. Because so many people love his books and liked Neil Gaiman and just didn't expect him to be the big creep that, you know, it turns out that he was. And I remember feeling a similar way about Isaac Asimov, who I like a lot. I like his books a lot. And I liked him a lot because he seemed like such a cool guy. You know, whenever I'd see interviews by him or read any of his nonfiction or whatever, he seemed cool. But then it turned out that he had a groping problem. You know, he would grope women frequently. In fact, I guess, apparently, he was known for this. And when he came to the office, you know, the publishing office, you know, the women would be like, oh God, Isaac Asimov's coming, you know. But And of course, it was back in the 60s and 70s, so it was not taken all that seriously, you know, unfortunately, unlike now. But that was disappointing. I was very disappointed by that. And I don't know why I was so surprised, because, it, you know, with authors, with artists, it seems like there's always something, you know. And it usually doesn't bother me that much, because most of the writers that I really like, most of my favorite writers are dead and have been dead for a long time and can in no way profit from my liking them. I love H.P. Lovecraft's work. H.P. Lovecraft, though, oh, he had some issues with his views. Racist, and you know, that's not great, but his work was fantastic. But Lovecraft can in no way profit from my liking him or talking about him. He can't profit in any way, because he's too dead. Neil Gaiman, however, if you buy Neil Gaiman's books, Neil Gaiman does profit from that. So if you're a booktuber, if you're on BookTube, it's a dilemma. You know, when writers are dead, it's easier. But this guy, if I talk about this book and I talk about how great it is, and I talk about his other books and how great they are, well, people might buy those books, and then Neil Gaiman will profit. And maybe you don't want that, because Neil Gaiman's a big creep. So that's the dilemma. But I think you do, you know, have to separate the art from the artist. That term we've heard a lot recently. It's actually true, I think, because this exists separate from Neil Gaiman. He wrote this, it now exists in the world. It has to be judged on its own merits, as its own thing. That's the same thing with every book up here. They all exist separate from the author who created them. It's interesting to learn about the authors who wrote these works, because it's always interesting to find out why or what motivated them to write the books. It's just an interesting subject, even if they turn out to be, you know, creepy in some way. And let's face it, it seems like most writers and artists have something going on. I mean, either they drank, or they were on a lot of drugs, or they committed terrible crimes. That's not an unusual thing. And if you stopped reading books, if you decide, okay, I'm not going to read books anymore by people who did anything shady, you know, just be prepared to take all the books off your shelf. You know, I mean, except maybe Gareth Howell's book, but every other book, just be prepared to, you know, take them off the shelf, because eventually you might find something that you didn't like, that you don't like about the artist or the author. It's just the way it is. So you have to judge these things separately. The writer is one thing. What the writer wrote is something else entirely. That exists on its own and must be judged on its own. And you should be able to judge a book even if you know nothing about the author. You could forget the author entirely, you know, if you want to, and just judge the book on the book. That said, it's an understandable dilemma that Neil Gaiman has presented to us, because these books are enormously popular. They're very well loved. And now when you talk about them, it's like, oh yeah, but I know about, but the book, you know. But the book stands on its own. American Gods is its own thing. It exists separately from Neil Gaiman, and it's okay to read it, it's okay to like it. It doesn't mean you like Neil Gaiman. But yeah, the whole thing about buying his books, he does profit from that. So that is the dilemma, you know. Fortunately for me, Roger, most of the books that I like are written by dead people. And, you know, it doesn't matter how awful they were. They can't profit from me liking them. It's very unlikely that we'll bring them back to life. It's not 100% certain that we won't, but it's unlikely, you know. They will probably all stay dead. But, you know, for those writers that are still alive who are creeps, yeah, that's a dilemma. But you shouldn't feel bad about reading their books. You shouldn't feel bad about enjoying their books because their books exist on their own. They are their own things. And human beings are complicated creatures. And they have more than one side to them. And their creative side can be amazing. And they can still do shady stuff, you know. But it's the amazing part that's important, because that, you know, to us as readers, because that created these works that we so enjoy. But yeah, they could be real creeps sometimes. What do you do? I guess that's all I have to say about it. I will catch you next time.